Hey guys, welcome back. So, dim the lights, maybe fluff your pillow a little, and let's glide into tonight's story. It's a long one. We're heading straight into one of history's noisiest upheavals, but don't worry, we'll keep it very quiet, very sleepy, and maybe just a little sarcastic. The French Revolution. Yes, the one with guillotines, powdered wigs, bread riots, and royals losing their heads, literally. But tonight, we're not here to get your adrenaline pumping. We're here to turn chaos into a gentle lullaby. So, lie back, relax, and let's float into 18th century France, where everything was covered in lace, wigs were taller than doorframes, and people were starving while the aristocrats complained about drafty palaces. Now, let's just say by the 1780s, France was in a situation we'd politely call a financial nightmare. They had debts stacked higher than Versailles mirrors, decades of wars because the French crown couldn't resist meddling everywhere, had drained the treasury. The 7 Years' War, disaster. The American Revolution, expensive helping hand. Because apparently, nothing says we're broke like funding someone else's independence. Meanwhile, regular people, peasants, artisans, shopkeepers were taxed like lemons being squeezed dry. Bread was their main food, but prices kept climbing. A loaf could cost almost a day's wages, which is not ideal if you plan to survive. And hovering above it all was King Louis XVI, a man often described as indecisive, which is the polite historian's code for this guy had no clue what he was doing. He was well-meaning, sort of, but let's be honest, Louis was more interested in hunting trips and tinkering with locks than actually ruling a country about to explode. And then, of course, there was Marie Antoinette. Poor girl. Well, not poor financially, but poor in PR. She gets remembered as the let them eat cake queen, which, fun fact, she probably never said. But she did have a taste for lavish spending, gowns that required 2 people to carry, and hairstyles that could double as birdhouses. Let's just say, subtlety was not her strongest suit. But before we get too cozy with wigs and pastries, let's drift back a little. France's entire social system, the Ancien Regime, was basically a pyramid scheme. At the top, you had the first estate, the clergy, priests, bishops, abbots, people who prayed for your soul, but also collected taxes. Nice deal. Then the second estate, the nobility. These were your dukes, counts, marquises. They owned vast lands and lived tax-free lives while peasants plowed the fields. And finally, the third estate, everyone else, which is a polite way of saying 97% of the population. Farmers, merchants, lawyers, servants, beggars, you name it. They paid all the taxes, did all the work, and basically kept the country running while being told to be grateful. Now, if you sense that this system might cause resentment, you'd be correct. But of course, the French elite thought it was eternal, because why not assume you can live forever on velvet cushions while everyone else eats dirt? Things really started simmering in 1788. Food shortages, financial collapse, and a monarchy too clueless to fix it. So Louis called the Estates General. This hadn't been done in 175 years, so people were like, wow, things must be bad if the king actually wants opinions. The Estates General was supposed to be a meeting where representatives from all 3 estates got together and solved France's problems. But here's the twist. Each estate got 1 vote. Clergy, 1. Nobility, 1. Everyone else, the 97% of France, also 1. Math was not on the peasant's side. Naturally, the Third Estate wasn't thrilled. They wanted voting by head, not by estate, because, basic fairness. But Louis and his nobles? Nope, tradition was so much more comfortable. So the Third Estate decided, fine, we'll just make our own assembly, the National Assembly. They took the famous tennis court oath, swearing not to disband until they gave France a constitution. It was the political version of slamming the door and starting your own band. And then, July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille. You've probably heard of it. Basically, a crowd in Paris decided to attack this medieval fortress prison. Why? Well, partly because it symbolized royal tyranny, also because they needed weapons. The Bastille wasn't exactly bursting with prisoners, only 7 were inside that day. But the symbolism was what mattered. The fall of the Bastille was like a giant, "we're done with this nonsense" declaration. And every year since, France celebrates it as Bastille Day. It's like their 4th of July, except with more guillotines and fewer barbecues. Of course, the revolution didn't stop at symbolic prisons. It quickly turned into a complete restructuring of society. Feudal dues, gone. Aristocratic privileges, canceled. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, drafted in 1789, and it boldly stated that all men are free and equal. Well, unless you were a woman, then you were politely ignored. Sorry, ladies. But as things often go in history, the revolution got complicated. And by complicated, I mean messy, bloody, and full of committees arguing endlessly. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, let's just drift on this image. The old order collapsing, people marching with tricolor cockades, and powdered wigs starting to look very out of fashion. And with that gentle crash of a monarchy teetering on its wobbly legs, let's float into our next phase. What happens when you try to reinvent a country overnight? So, let's float gently onward. We've got the Bastille stormed, the monarchy spooked, and the National Assembly feeling pretty proud of itself. But revolutions, much like bad house renovations, rarely stay clean and simple. Things were about to get a little more chaotic. Now, if you were a peasant in 1789, life was still rough. Sure, the Bastille fell, which was exciting in theory, but bread prices were still sky high. And honestly, you can't exactly feed your kids with political symbolism. A loaf of bread still cost nearly a day's pay, which is not the kind of diet plan anyone asked for. And then came what historians like to call the Great Fear, which sounds dramatic, like a medieval horror movie, but was basically peasants panicking en masse. Rumors spread across the countryside that aristocrats were hiring mercenaries to crush the revolution. So peasants did what peasants often do when cornered. They grabbed their pitchforks, torches, and a surprising amount of courage and attacked their lord's manors. Grain stores were looted, feudal documents were burned, and a lot of nobles decided maybe it was time for a quiet vacation abroad. The nobles called it anarchy. The peasants called it dinner. Back in Paris, the mood wasn't much better. People were still starving, and Louis XVI was still dithering like a man trying to pick a Netflix show. He wasn't exactly projecting strength, and Marie Antoinette still rocking diamonds like there wasn't a bread crisis outside her palace gates. So in October 1789, the women of Paris decided enough was enough. Thousands of them marched the 12 miles to Versailles, armed with whatever they could carry: clubs, pikes, kitchen knives. These weren't dainty ladies in lace. These were tough, hungry women demanding bread, action, and maybe a little royal accountability. It's called the Women's March on Versailles, but honestly, it was less of a march and more of a tidal wave. They barged into the palace, shouting for flour, scaring guards, and at one point even breaking into Marie Antoinette's bedchamber. She barely escaped, probably regretting every tall hairstyle she'd ever worn. The message was clear. Paris was done with royal aloofness, and so the king and queen were essentially escorted, dragged back to Paris. From that point on, Louis XVI wasn't ruling France from Versailles. He was basically under house arrest at the Tuileries Palace, a gilded cage with better curtains. Now in the National Assembly, things were buzzing. The revolution was rewriting everything, abolishing feudal privileges, drafting new laws, and creating what they hoped would be a shiny constitutional monarchy. The kind where the king still wore a crown, but Parliament actually had a say. Louis naturally didn't love this. He signed the Constitution reluctantly, like a student handing in homework they clearly didn't want to do. Meanwhile, nobles kept fleeing France. They became known as émigrés, a polite French word for "we're running away before the mob shows up." And many of them went to Austria, Prussia, or anywhere that still liked powdered wigs. And of course, they began plotting counter-revolution from abroad. Because nothing says loyalty to your country like abandoning it the second things get difficult. Now, let's pause and imagine the vibe in Paris around 1790. You've got banners proclaiming liberty, equality, fraternity. You've got cockades pinned on hats, taverns buzzing with debates, newspapers cranking out revolutionary hot takes. It was exciting, sure, but also exhausting. And hovering in the background was the ever-growing sense that things weren't quite stable, like a wobbly chair that looks fine until you actually sit on it. The revolution was reshaping the church too. The civil constitution of the clergy turned priests into state employees, which, as you might guess, didn't go over well with Rome. Suddenly, going to Mass wasn't just about prayer, it was a political statement. And if there's one thing France loves, it's turning even religion into a heated argument. But the biggest problem of all, the king and queen themselves. Louis may have signed the Constitution, but deep down, he still believed in divine right monarchy. He didn't want to be a constitutional king, he wanted to be the king. And Marie Antoinette, she wanted out, preferably with her head still attached. So in June 1791, the royal family tried to escape, the famous flight to Varennes. They dressed up in disguises because apparently nothing screams stealthy than putting the 6-foot-tall king in a wig and calling him a butler. Spoiler, it didn't work. They were recognized, arrested, and marched back to Paris in humiliation. From that moment on, any remaining trust between the monarchy and the revolutionaries evaporated. Louis was now less of a king and more of a liability. Outside France, other monarchies were watching nervously. Austria and Prussia, in particular, weren't thrilled about the whole toppling monarchs vibe. After all, if France could do it, maybe their subjects would get ideas too. So the revolution began spiraling into international conflict. France declared war in 1792 because apparently nothing calms a revolution like also fighting half of Europe. Spoiler again, France wasn't exactly ready. Their armies were chaotic, generals were suspect, and morale was mixed. But revolutionary enthusiasm was high. Volunteers streamed into the military, singing the newly composed La Marseillaise, which, by the way, is still France's national anthem. Catchy, loud, and perfect for marching. Maybe not ideal for bedtime. Back home, things in Paris reached a fever pitch. The king was officially suspended in August 1792, and a new radical body, the National Convention, took charge. This was no longer about reforming monarchy. It was about abolishing it completely. And by September, France declared itself a republic. A bold experiment, though whether it would survive was another question entirely. Now, what do you do with a king once you've declared you don't need kings anymore? That's right, you put him on trial. Louis XVI was charged with treason because apparently trying to flee your country and secretly plotting with Austria isn't a great look. The trial was long, tense, and honestly a foregone conclusion. In January 1793, Louis XVI was found guilty. And on January 21st, he was executed by guillotine in the Place de Revolution. Crowds gathered, the blade fell, and France entered a new, more radical phase of its revolution. Marie Antoinette, of course, would follow later that year. Her trial was even messier, with accusations ranging from treason to ridiculous personal scandals. She kept her dignity, reportedly saying, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it," when she accidentally stepped on her executioner's foot. Even in death, she had a bit of grace.
So, here we are. It's 1793. The king is gone, the queen is waiting her turn, and France is officially a republic. Which sounds inspiring, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity, all that good stuff. But in reality, it was more like paranoia, executions, and too many committees. A republic, yes, but a republic on the world's shakiest foundations. The new government, the National Convention, wasn't exactly a model of unity. You had different factions, all with dramatic names, like the Girondins and the Jacobins, because apparently nothing says serious politics like naming your group after the club where you meet for wine and arguments. The Girondins were more moderate. They wanted reform, yes, but without turning every street corner into a guillotine station. The Jacobins, on the other hand, were like, reform is nice, but have you considered purging everyone who disagrees with us? And guess which group gained the upper hand? Yep, the Jacobins. And so begins what we call the Reign of Terror, which, to be fair, is not the most relaxing chapter name in history. But don't worry, we'll make it soft and sleepy anyway. Think of it less as terror and more as a very long, very grim nap. At the center of it all was Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer, intellectual, and revolutionary who somehow became the patron saint of radical virtue. He preached morality, equality, and incorruptibility, while also signing off on thousands of executions. Because nothing says incorruptible virtue like daily trips to the guillotine. Robespierre wasn't alone, of course. He had allies like Georges Danton, the fiery orator with a booming voice, and Jean-Paul Marat, the perpetually angry journalist who basically lived in his bathtub because of a nasty skin condition. Yes, you heard that right. Marat literally worked from his bathtub. Revolutionary life was glamorous. Now, you might think, surely the terror was about removing aristocrats, right? Getting rid of the last nobles clinging to their wigs. Well, not exactly. Yes, plenty of nobles went under the blade, but so did priests, moderate politicians, and even other revolutionaries. Basically, anyone suspected of being against the revolution or not revolutionary enough was fair game. And since paranoia spreads faster than Parisian gossip, accusations flew everywhere. Trials were short, evidence optional, and verdicts almost always guilty. The guillotine became the most efficient piece of furniture in Paris. People even started calling it the national razor, because why not give your mass execution device a cute nickname? Meanwhile, outside Paris, France was dealing with revolts, especially in the Vendée region. Royalists, peasants, and Catholics rose up against the revolutionary government. The rebellion turned into brutal fighting, with atrocities on both sides. It was less liberty for all and more whoever's left standing. And as if that wasn't enough, France was still at war with pretty much all of Europe. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, you name it. It was like a very unfriendly neighborhood block party.
But somehow, amidst all this, France's revolutionary armies actually started winning, thanks in part to sheer numbers, but also because they were fighting with the zeal of people who had everything to lose. And also because their opponents underestimated them. Always a classic mistake. Back in Paris, the terror intensified in 1794. Robespierre and his allies pushed harder and harder for virtue through fear. He gave speeches about moral purity while greenlighting more executions. Danton eventually got nervous about all the killing. He suggested maybe slowing down a little, which of course earned him a one-way ticket to the guillotine, along with his big mouth. Marat, he didn't last either. In 1793, he was assassinated in his bathtub by Charlotte Corday, a Guillotine sympathizer. She thought killing him would end the bloodshed. Instead, it just turned him into a revolutionary martyr. Paris even displayed his bathtub like a relic. Imagine explaining that on a museum tour. By mid-1794, even Robespierre's allies started feeling uneasy. His obsession with virtue was getting intense. He began giving paranoid speeches, hinting that even his closest supporters might be plotting against him. And here's the thing. When you lead by fear, people eventually turn on you out of, well, fear. So in July 1794, Robespierre was arrested, tried, and yes, you guessed it, executed by guillotine. The man who had sent thousands to his own depths met the same fate. Irony so thick, you could spread it on toast. And just like that, the terror ended. France collectively exhaled. Like someone finally shut off a very loud, very grim alarm clock. The aftermath? Well, France was still a republic, but now it was run by a more moderate government called the Directory, which was basically 5 guys trying to keep the country together while everyone else argued. Spoiler, it didn't go great. But before we drift into the Directory's sleepy disasters, let's pause on this image of a city exhausted by fear, heads no longer rolling quite as often, and people slowly daring to breathe again.
So, Robespierre is gone. The guillotine finally got tired. Paris unclenched its jaw a little, and France moved into its next experiment in government, the Directory. Which sounds organized, doesn't it? Like a filing cabinet, or maybe a polite phone book. But in reality, the Directory was, well, let's call it messy. After the Reign of Terror, everyone was traumatized. No one wanted another Robespierre situation. So instead of one leader, France set up a government run by 5 directors. Because, 5 people arguing is so much more efficient than one. The idea was to balance power, avoid dictatorship, and bring stability. The reality was corruption, indecision, and a revolving door of scandals. Basically, imagine 5 roommates trying to split rent, but with the fate of an entire country on the line. Now, the Directory's biggest problem was money. France was broke. Again. Still. Always. Taxes weren't enough, the wars were expensive, and inflation was chewing through whatever coins were left in people's pockets. So, what did the Directory do? Print more paper money. Spoiler, it went about as well as you'd expect. Food shortages returned, bread prices soared, because of course they did, and riots flared up again. The Parisian crowd had gotten quite good at rioting by now. It was practically a national sport. Politically, the Directory faced enemies from every direction. Royalists wanted to bring back the monarchy. Jacobin radicals wanted to bring back the terror. And ordinary people just wanted bread and maybe 1 week without a riot.
The directors, naturally, responded with repression, censorship, and the occasional coup, very stabilizing. And then there was the army. The French military had grown massive during the Revolution, fueled by volunteers and conscription, but keeping soldiers fed and paid was tricky. The solution? Let the armies live off the land. Translation? Let them loot whatever they find, which made France's neighbors even more thrilled to have them around. But here's where our story perks up slightly. A certain young general from Corsica began making a name for himself, Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, him, the guy with the hand and coat pose, the one history memes can't resist. In the mid-1990s, Napoleon was just another ambitious officer, but he was good, scarily good. He had a knack for strategy, charisma with his troops, and the kind of relentless ambition that makes you both admire and fear someone. The Directory quickly realized that while they were floundering, Napoleon was winning, and winning big. In 1796, Napoleon was given command of the army of Italy. Now, the Italian campaign could have been a disaster. France was broke, the army was ragged, and morale was low. But Napoleon turned it into a series of stunning victories. He outmaneuvered Austrian forces, seized supplies, and basically transformed his starving army into a juggernaut. Soldiers adored him, generals envied him, politicians feared him. Back in Paris, Napoleon's victories were splashed across newspapers. He became a national hero practically overnight, which was slightly awkward for the Directory, because while they were struggling to keep the lights on, Napoleon was out there acting like France's golden boy. And Napoleon wasn't shy about building his image. He had bulletins printed exaggerating his victories, turning even minor skirmishes into epic triumphs. Think of him as the original influencer, but with cannons instead of Instagram filters. The Directory, desperate for good news, didn't complain too much. As long as Napoleon kept winning abroad, maybe people at home would stop noticing how useless the government was. Spoiler, they did not stop noticing. Meanwhile, France's wars expanded. By the late 1990s, the Revolutionary Wars had spread across Europe. And while France sometimes stumbled, Napoleon kept winning. So naturally, in 1798, he was sent on a flashy expedition to Egypt. Because when you're bored of beating Austrians, why not pick a fight with the Ottoman Empire? The Egyptian campaign was, well, mixed. Militarily, Napoleon had some victories, but the British Navy, led by Admiral Nelson, smashed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, which meant Napoleon's army was basically stranded in Egypt. But Napoleon, being Napoleon, spun the whole thing as a heroic adventure. He even brought scientists and scholars along, turning Egypt into a research trip. That's when the Rosetta Stone was discovered, accidentally, while French soldiers were digging. So, thanks to Napoleon, we can read hieroglyphs today. A small win in the middle of a hot mess. Back in France, the Directory was collapsing under its own incompetence. Corruption scandals, unpopular wars, and constant coups made people yearn for strong leadership. And guess who conveniently returned from Egypt in 1799? Yes, Napoleon. He saw his chance. In November 1799, he staged a coup d'etat known as the 18th Brumaire, because the French revolutionaries had invented a brand new calendar that no one remembers, but we'll get to that in a bit. With soldiers at his side, Napoleon basically shoved the Directory out of power and replaced it with a new government, the consulate. And who was first consul? Why, Napoleon Bonaparte, of course. And just like that, the French Revolution, which had started as a fight against monarchy and absolute rulers, ended with a strong man seizing power. Ironic? Yes. Predictable? Also yes. The Directory had promised stability, but delivered chaos. Napoleon promised order and glory, and the French people, exhausted after a decade of upheaval, were willing to take the deal. So as we leave the 1790s behind, we find France transformed. The monarchy was gone, The revolution had chewed through kings, queens, radicals, and moderates alike. The ideals of liberty and equality were etched into law, but the reality was far messier. And waiting in the wings was Napoleon, ready to reshape not just France, but all of Europe.
So here we are, France, at the turn of the century. The revolution has done its thing. Monarchs executed, aristocrats fleeing, peasants rioting, and the Directory, well, it's politely called a failed experiment in governance. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte. By now, he's not just a general, he's a celebrity, a national hero, and frankly, very aware of his own genius. And yes, he had impressive hair, which in the 18th and 19th centuries counted for a lot. A little vanity never hurt a revolutionary general. Napoleon's first move as first consul was to stabilize France, because after years of chaos, stability sounds pretty nice, even if it's wrapped in a slightly authoritarian package. He reformed the tax system, streamlined the government, and reorganized the legal code. Practical stuff that normal governments do, except with a lot more medals and ceremonial parades. By 1802, Napoleon had managed to consolidate power. He made himself first consul for life because temporary leadership was so last decade. And in 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, which is worth pausing for, because typically kings and emperors let the Pope crown them. But Napoleon? He took the crown from the Pope and plopped it on his own head. Symbolically, he was saying, I'm in charge. Even the Pope can't tell me otherwise. Polite, subtle, and slightly arrogant. Very Napoleon. And so the revolution's messy dreams of liberty, equality, and fraternity had led to an emperor. Not exactly what Rousseau envisioned when he wrote about social contracts, but close enough. Napoleon wasn't content with just ruling France. He wanted to reshape Europe. His armies marched across the continent, winning battles with ruthless efficiency and impeccable timing. Austria, Prussia, Italy, Spain, they all faced the Napoleonic juggernaut. And somehow, even after years of chaos, France seemed organized under his command. But Napoleon's empire was built as much on bureaucracy as on cannons. He implemented the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that emphasized equality under law, for men at least, property rights, and merit-based advancement. For all his ego, Napoleon did leave behind some useful institutions: schools, courts, civil codes, basically the things that help a country function when your ruler is off conquering everything in sight. Of course, nothing is ever simple. Napoleon's rise had its quirks. He married Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow with connections and charm, because strategic marriage is history's favorite trope. But she didn't give him an heir, which led to a dramatic divorce later, because even emperors have to deal with family drama. Napoleon was also known for his meticulous attention to detail. He planned battles down to the hour, wrote letters with obsessive precision, and kept a tight leash on generals. Some admired him, some found him exhausting. Either way, he worked hard, which is more than you can say for poor Louis XVI. And while Napoleon's generals fought brilliantly, the wars did take their toll. Cities burned, countries exhausted, and civilians lived in perpetual nervous tension. But France itself, under Napoleon's rule, was relatively stable compared to the revolution's rollercoaster years. Economically, the country recovered. Taxes were collected efficiently. Infrastructure improved. Public order returned, and Paris, oh, Paris, sparkled like a jewel in the empire. The streets were cleaner, the palaces more majestic, and the citizens cautiously optimistic.
By 1805, Napoleon had crowned himself emperor and started a series of campaigns against coalitions of European powers. He won spectacular victories at Ulm and Austerlitz, solidifying his reputation as the strategic genius of the age. And yet, despite his brilliance, Napoleon was still very human. He had quirks, moods, and occasional meltdowns. He demanded loyalty, expected perfection, and could be ruthlessly impatient with subordinates. And like many powerful people, he had a tendency to exaggerate his own victories in reports sent home. Even his exile plans, wars, and family life had a slightly dramatic flair. He was, in every way, the perfect storm of charisma, ego, and strategic genius, a combination that would dominate Europe for the next decade. So, looking back, the revolution had started with a simple, if messy, idea. Take down the monarchy, give power to the people, and maybe have some bread along the way. What it gave France instead? Chaos, terror, radical ideas, a brief experiment in democracy, and eventually an emperor with very stylish hair and a tendency to micromanage armies. Napoleon's rise reminds us that revolutions rarely follow a straight path. They twist, turn, devour heroes, discard idealists, and often replace one form of concentrated power with another. It's history's gentle way of saying, humans are messy, and we like it that way. So, here we are in the early 1800s. Napoleon is emperor of the French, Europe is on tenterhooks, and France itself is running like a well-oiled, slightly authoritarian machine. Think less chaotic revolution and more efficient, stylish bureaucracy with cannons on standby. By 1805, Napoleon's empire stretched across much of Western and Central Europe. He had allies, puppets, relatives installed as kings, and a very neat administrative system. In short, the revolution's chaos had given way to surprisingly organized power. Paris glittered. Streets were patrolled. The Napoleonic Code ensured, at least on paper, equality before the law. Men could rise by merit. Taxes were predictable, and monuments were built to remind everyone who was boss, even if the rest of Europe grumbled about the growing French footprint. Napoleon, of course, wanted more, because ambition is his defining sleep-inducing trait. He crowned himself emperor, yes, but then proceeded to install family members on thrones across the continent. His brothers became kings in Naples, Holland, and Spain. His sisters married well, and cousins were granted duchies. The message was clear. Loyalty to Napoleon equals literal crown. Somehow, Napoleon also balanced a complicated personal life. He divorced Josephine because she didn't produce an heir and married Marie Louise, an Austrian archduchess, to secure a dynasty. He had his share of mistresses, and yes, letters he wrote to them can be read as a mix of tender and mildly obsessive. Nothing says great general like poetry about one's feelings between battles. The wars themselves were a carefully choreographed mix of brilliance and chaos. Austerlitz in 1805? Legendary. Napoleon outmaneuvered Austria and Russia in what historians still call a tactical masterpiece. His reputation soared. His generals adored him. Soldiers obeyed him blindly, and the rest of Europe mostly panicked, quietly. Napoleon's army was huge, efficient, and surprisingly loyal. He knew how to inspire them: speeches, medals, food when possible, and a very consistent system of promotion based on merit. He liked predictability. Soldiers liked rewards. It worked. Yet, even at the height of his empire, there were cracks. Running an empire across Europe, constantly at war, and managing family on thrones was exhausting. Eventually, fatigue, overreach, and stubborn ambition start to show consequences. So, by the early 1810s, Napoleon's empire was massive. France dominated much of Europe. Family members sat on thrones, armies moved like clockwork, and Paris sparkled as the jewel of Europe. But, as with all peaks, there's a gentle slope downward waiting to appear. One of Napoleon's big challenges was Britain. Despite all his military brilliance, France could not crush the British Empire. Napoleon's continental system, designed to strangle British trade, was failing. Smugglers, neutral countries, and sheer distance made enforcement almost impossible. No matter how hard he tried, Britain still thrived. So, Napoleon turned his attention east, Russia. In 1812, he assembled the Grande Armée, a force of over 600,000 men. A huge army, magnificent in scale, disciplined in theory, and exhausting to manage in reality. The plan was simple, if ambitious. March into Russia, force Tsar Alexander I to comply with the continental system, and assert French dominance once and for all. The invasion began with confidence. Napoleon's troops advanced deep into Russian territory, but as they moved further from home, supply lines stretched thin. Weather became a constant companion. Sudden rains, muddy roads, and eventually snow. And the Russians? Well, they had a strategy. Retreat, destroy supplies, and lure the French deeper into the cold. It's called the scorched earth tactic. Very effective, very cold, and very discouraging when your stomach is empty and your boots are wet. Napoleon's army reached Moscow in September 1812, but the city had been abandoned and set on fire by its residents. There were no victorious parades, no supplies to stock, just smoke, ash, and a growing sense of despair. Napoleon stayed in the burning city for a month, hoping somehow the Russians would negotiate. They didn't. By October, with winter approaching, he ordered a retreat. This retreat turned into a disaster. Frostbite, starvation, and constant harassment by Russian forces decimated the army. From over 600,000 men, only around 100,000 survived. It was a humbling moment. Even the greatest general can be undone by weather, logistics, and stubborn opponents. Back in Paris, news of the disaster spread slowly. At first, disbelief, then worry, then anxiety. The empire that seemed invincible now looked fragile. Allies wavered, enemies smelled weakness. Coalitions formed again. Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, they all prepared to challenge France. Napoleon had rebuilt an army, but France had been at war for over a decade. Exhaustion, economic strain, and stretched resources made the task increasingly difficult. Napoleon's domestic situation also showed cracks. People had accepted his rule when he brought stability. Now, the constant wars, taxes, and losses were wearing patience thin. Loyalty was tested, and for the first time in many years, Napoleon faced resistance not just abroad, but at home. His family on thrones abroad were also facing rebellions and uprisings. Spain, in particular, continued its guerrilla resistance, bleeding French resources. Napoleon's empire, once tidy and tightly controlled, now looks like a sprawling puzzle with pieces slipping apart. The Russian campaign marked the beginning of a slow but steady decline. Napoleon was still brilliant, still commanding respect, but circumstances were catching up to him. Overextension, unpredictable weather, national resistance, and coalitions of Europe were all converging. By 1813, France would be fighting on multiple fronts. Battles were less certain. Allies wavered, and the aura of invincibility that Napoleon had cultivated for over a decade began to fade. So, by 1814, the cracks in Napoleon's empire had widened into gaping chasms. After the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812 and the bloody battles of 1813, the Allies, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria were finally pushing deep into French territory. The once invincible Grande Armée had been shattered. Napoleon was still clever, still charismatic, still the Napoleon everyone feared. But the sheer exhaustion of France and the relentless coalition of enemies were too much, even for him. Paris itself became a theater of inevitability. The Allies advanced, skirmishes and sieges made the countryside tense, and the city braced for what was coming. Napoleon, ever the strategist, tried to rally defenses, but French resources were stretched thin, soldiers tired, and morale slipping. By March 1814, the Allies entered Paris almost unopposed. Napoleon's options were dwindling, resistance would be costly, and the city's survival was at stake. So, reluctantly, he accepted what he had long resisted: abdication. Napoleon was sent into exile on the island of Elba, a small Mediterranean island off the coast of Italy. It was picturesque, yes, but tiny, hardly the sweeping stage for a man who had once ruled Europe. He was allowed a small army, a bit of revenue, and of course, all the paperwork and bureaucracy necessary to maintain a modest court. He settled in, planning, observing, and perhaps scheming. Elba was not Paris, not France, not an empire, but it was quiet, peaceful, sleep-inducing in the most ironic way possible for someone who had spent years orchestrating battles across Europe. Meanwhile, back in France, the monarchy returned. Louis XVIII, brother of Louis XVI, took the throne. France had shifted back to kingship, but after decades of turmoil, it wasn't exactly a smooth transition. The people, accustomed to revolution and empire, were wary. Some were loyal to the old monarchy, some still remembered the revolution, and a number, unsurprisingly, still adored Napoleon. And adore him they did. Within less than a year, Napoleon staged what we now call the 100 Days. In March 1815, he escaped Elba, landed in France, and began marching toward Paris. Soldiers, still loyal to the man who had brought glory and victories, flocked to him. Louis XVIII's forces melted away in the face of popular support for the returning emperor. Within weeks, Napoleon reclaimed power. France was, for a moment, again under the rule of its once exiled general. But this resurgence, while dramatic, was also fragile. The European powers had learned from previous mistakes. They assembled forces to confront Napoleon decisively. The climax, of course, came at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815. Napoleon, commanding once more, faced the British under Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher. The battle was intense, chaotic, and strategically fascinating. Yet, despite his brilliance, Napoleon was defeated. His army, though loyal, was exhausted and outnumbered. Logistics, weather, and simple bad luck played their part. And so the man who had reshaped Europe found himself humbled on the fields of Belgium. After Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled again, but this time much farther away. He was sent to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. It was picturesque, yes, but tiny, hardly the sweeping stage for a man who had once ruled Europe. He was allowed a small army, a bit of revenue, and of course, all the paperwork and bureaucracy necessary to maintain a modest court. He settled in, walking, reading, dictating memoirs, and reflecting. A far cry from the grandeur of Paris and the battlefields of Europe. It was a slow, inevitable fading of a man who had once seemed unstoppable. Napoleon died there in 2021, still a figure of fascination, controversy, and legend. From revolutionary general to emperor to exile, his life mirrored the dramatic swings of the era he had dominated. And so, by the mid-1820s, France had settled into something resembling stability. The revolution's ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity remained influential, even as monarchs returned and new political tensions simmered beneath the surface. The story of the French Revolution from 1789 to Napoleon's exile is one of extremes. The fall of kings, the rise of the people, chaos, terror, glory, and finally, exhaustion. So by the 1820s, the dust of the revolution and Napoleon's empire had finally settled. Kings had returned, exiled emperors had passed away, and France was, at least superficially, calmer. But calm in history is rarely boring. It's usually quietly transformative. The French Revolution had been, at its heart, about ideas, liberty, equality, fraternity, the overthrow of entrenched privilege, a dramatic rethinking of what it meant to govern and be governed. Even though the revolution had been messy, terrifyingly messy at times, its ideas didn't disappear. They lingered, whispered into constitutions, laws, and political movements across Europe and the world. Politically, the revolution had planted seeds that could not be entirely uprooted. Even when monarchs returned, governments could not fully ignore the concepts of citizen rights, civic representation, and social reform. Constitutions became more common, voting rights slowly expanded, and political activism became a feature of public life, rather than an occasional rebellious spark. Napoleon, paradoxically, both advanced and constrained these ideas. His rule centralized power and crowned himself emperor, yes, but he also codified laws, promoted meritocracy for men, and modernized administration. Some historians argue he preserved parts of the revolution in a more structured form. Others say he betrayed its spirit by consolidating power. The debate continues, quietly, like the slow hum of history itself. Socially, the revolution reshaped French society. The aristocracy's privileges were largely abolished, feudal obligations ended, and a culture of merit and mobility began to emerge. Ordinary citizens who had once been ignored or oppressed now had some measure of agency. Of course, these changes weren't instantaneous and they weren't uniform. Some regions clung to old ways, some embraced new ones eagerly. But the trajectory was clear. Society would never entirely revert to the old hierarchical model. Once people had tasted political upheaval, the memory lingered, gently influencing the next generations. Culturally, the revolution left a deep mark. Symbols, songs, art, literature, all reflected the dramatic spirit of the era. Revolutionary festivals, the tricolor flag, and the language of liberty and equality permeated daily life. Even in exile, Napoleon's legend continued to inspire fascination, discussion, and occasional romanticization of the man who changed Europe. And speaking of romanticization, let's be honest, there is something irresistibly traumatic about this period. Heads rolling, armies marching, emperors exiled and then returning, idealists dreaming of liberty, radicals enforcing terror, and generals reshaping continents. It's messy, it's human, and it's oddly comforting if you like history that moves slowly but inexorably. Internationally, the revolution sparked similar movements elsewhere. Revolts, calls for constitutional reform, and challenges to traditional monarchies gained momentum across Europe and Latin America. The French example, chaotic, terrifying, brilliant, served as both a warning and an inspiration. And yet, there's an important subtlety here. The revolution didn't provide a perfect template. It provided a story. The story of what can happen when the old order is dismantled, when people act collectively, and when ambition and ideology collide. Every country interpreted it differently, and history continued, softly to echo its lessons. Emotionally, psychologically, the revolution left its mark. Entire generations lived through fear, hope, disillusionment, and sometimes exultation. The people who survived the guillotine, the wars, the exiles, well, they carried those experiences forward, quietly shaping family histories, memories, and the collective consciousness of France. Even today, the revolution's symbols, liberty caps, Marianne, the tricolor, evoke more than patriotism. They remind us of a time when ordinary people dared to dream, when kings fell, and when the world briefly seemed mutable. So as we drift toward the conclusion of our slow historical journey, consider this. The French Revolution was not tidy. It was not polite. It was not calm. But it was transformative. It changed politics, society, culture, and even the psychology of generations. And through Napoleon, it showed how revolution and empire can intertwine in strange, ironic, and occasionally tragic ways. The story is messy, yes, but there's a rhythm to it. Rise, fall, exile, return, decline, like waves lapping gently against the shores of history, quietly reshaping the coastline. It's exhausting if you lived it, but fascinating if you read it slowly, and even more so if you narrate it softly, almost like a bedtime story. So, here we are at the final part of our long, slow journey through the French Revolution. From the storming of the Bastille to Napoleon's exile, we've floated through chaos, terror, ambition, and brilliance. And now, we reflect. The revolution was, in many ways, a paradox. It began with lofty ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, but descended into terror, war, and extraordinary human drama. It toppled kings, executed queens, and toppled entire social hierarchies. Yet it also gave birth to ideas, institutions, and social changes that outlasted the guillotine and the battlefields. Politically, the revolution set the stage for modern governments. Constitutions, citizen rights, representative bodies, these concepts gained traction in Europe and beyond. Even monarchies that returned were cautious, having seen firsthand what happens when the populace grows restless. Napoleon, though an emperor, carried forward certain revolutionary legacies: meritocracy, codified law, centralized administration. These were innovations born of necessity during the revolution and solidified under his rule. They created structures that outlived his exile and continued to shape Europe long after 1815. Socially, the revolution dismantled entrenched privilege. Feudal obligations ended. Aristocrats lost automatic authority. Citizens gained political agency, and the very notion of equality, however imperfectly applied, became a principle to aspire to. These social ripples spread slowly, influencing ideas of justice, opportunity, and rights in generations to come. Culturally, the revolution's dramatic flair left a mark as well. Revolutionary symbols, songs, festivals, and public art reminded citizens of the extraordinary times they had lived through. Even as governments changed, these symbols persisted, quietly carrying forward the memory of what people were willing to fight and die for. Napoleon's story, intertwined with the revolution, is also instructive. He embodied its contradictions, the pursuit of order and stability while wielding almost absolute power, brilliance and ambition coupled with human fallibility. His rise and fall illustrate a lesson the revolution itself hinted at. Ideals are fragile, human ambition is relentless, and history rarely unfolds neatly. Even the most spectacular military victories and sweeping political reforms cannot entirely control the unpredictability of people, weather, and circumstances. The revolution was a reminder that history is not a straight line. It's a long, meandering river with rapids, eddies, and calm stretches, all flowing together. Emotionally, the revolution shaped the lives of ordinary people and elites alike. Fear, hope, courage, despair, they all played roles. Generations carried forward memories of violence, triumph, loss, and survival. That psychological imprint is part of why the revolution remains so compelling. Even centuries later, we read, reflect, and marvel, not just at the facts, but at the human stories embedded in them. And globally, the revolution's ripple effects were profound. It inspired movements in Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Ideas of citizen rights, social justice, and the questioning of authority traveled far from France. Revolution became a language for change, a language that persists in various forms even today. So, as we settle into the gentle close of this long historical journey, what can we take away? Revolutions are messy, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying. Ideals can survive even amidst chaos, violence, and ambitious individuals. History is cyclical: rise and fall, glory and disaster, and ambition and consequence. And above all, the human element, the choices, fears, and desires of individuals drive events as much as armies and laws. The French Revolution, in all its drama and paradox, reminds us that people can reshape the world. Slowly, messily, sometimes tragically, but always profoundly.
Even decades after the last cannon fired and Napoleon took his final exile, the French Revolution whispers quietly through history. It's the kind of whisper that doesn't jolt you awake. It floats softly, like a memory of a dream you half remember. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity became more than slogans. They became questions we ask ourselves. What is justice? What is fairness? What is the balance between freedom and order? The revolution reminds us that these questions aren't solved once and for all. They echo through generations, softly, insistently, and sometimes stubbornly. Modern France still carries the revolution's imprint. Streets named for heroes, statues remembering martyrs, and holidays commemorating liberty. Even government structures, schools, and the legal code carry subtle echoes of those tumultuous years. And globally, every time people rise for rights, question authority, or imagine a fairer society, they are, in some small way, conversing with 1789. Napoleon, too, lives on, not just as a cautionary tale of ambition, but as a reminder that humans are endlessly creative, capable of both brilliance and hubris. He reminds us that history is not just events, but personalities, ambitions, flaws, and dreams. So as we finally drift to a close, consider the revolution not as a story of chaos, terror, and exile, but as a long, winding journey of human potential. Ordinary people, monarchs, generals, thinkers, they all left traces, some tragic, some brilliant, some quietly ordinary. And together, they shaped a world that still whispers their story today. Dim the lights, settle into your bed, and let the gentle waves of history float past. Kings, emperors, and revolutionaries, all gone, but their echoes remain, softly reminding us that even the most turbulent times have a rhythm, a slow, endless rhythm. And that's the story of the French Revolution, now resting quietly, waiting for the next listener to drift through its whispers. Good night. Even after decades, the French Revolution continues to whisper in subtle ways. It wasn't just battles, guillotines, or crowned emperors. It was symbols,
ideas, and quiet human stories that endure. The tricolor flag, Marianne, revolutionary songs, even the streets and squares of Paris, they all carry echoes of that era. They remind us that revolutions are more than events. They are emotional and cultural imprints that persist quietly over generations. Consider the ordinary people. Those who lined up for bread, debated in cafes, whispered in marketplaces. Their lives were small in the grand narrative, but collectively, they shaped history. Revolutions are rarely made by kings alone. They are made by millions of small choices, fears, hopes, and stubborn acts of persistence. The elites, the aristocrats, and the monarchs also left stories worth noting. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and the fleeing nobles weren't just villains or victims. They were humans navigating chaos, often cluelessly, sometimes tragically. Their struggles and mistakes offer gentle reminders of how power, privilege, and human frailty intersect. Napoleon's story is part of this reflection too. He reminds us that brilliance and hubris coexist, that ideas can be preserved, even in authoritarian frameworks, and that history often balances genius with consequence. His exile and final days on St. Helena are almost poetic, quiet, reflective, and far removed from the roaring crowds of Paris. So, if we step back, the French Revolution teaches lessons that are subtle rather than dramatic. Ideas endure longer than violence. People's choices ripple across generations. Symbols, flags, songs, monuments carry meaning beyond immediate events. History flows gently, even amid chaos, and leaves traces in culture, law, and collective memory. In this sense, Part 12 serves as a soft exhale. Not more battles, not more blood, not more drama, just reflection. The revolution is done. Napoleon is gone. Kings and republics have come and gone, but the echoes remain.